Sign it. You get nothing, Daniel said, his voice smooth and almost amused, like he was closing a routine business deal instead of a 38-year marriage, and I remember thinking, not for the first time, how easily a man can confuse silence for surrender. The pen felt heavier than it should have in my hand, a simple black fountain pen he'd once given me for our anniversary, back when gifts still meant something, back when I still believed that loyalty had weight. That time built something permanent, but as I looked down at the divorce papers laid neatly across the polished oak table, I realized permanence had never been part of Daniel Whitmore's vocabulary, only leverage. The courtroom was quiet in that particular way that isn't peaceful, just controlled, like everyone was waiting for something to break, and behind Daniel, seated with perfect posture and that carefully practiced half-smile, was Emily, my daughter-in-law, her blonde hair falling over one shoulder like she had stepped out of a magazine instead of into the wreckage of a family she had slowly, methodically helped dismantle. I didn't look at her for long, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. I had already seen enough over the past year to understand exactly who she was, and more importantly, exactly what she thought of me. Go ahead, Daniel added, tapping the document with 2 fingers, the gesture impatient, dismissive, as if I were taking too long to accept something inevitable. And maybe that's what he believed, that this moment was the final step in a process he had already won, that everything important had already been decided behind closed doors, in whispered conversations and quiet transfers and signatures I was never meant to see. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, and lowered the pen to the paper, my hand steady, my breathing even, because there is a kind of power in not rushing, in letting people sit inside their own certainty just a little longer, letting them believe the story they've written for you is the only version that exists. The scratch of ink against paper sounded louder than it should have, or maybe everything else had just gone too quiet, and as my name formed in careful practice letters, I could feel Daniel watching me, not with sadness, not even with anger, but with something colder, something closer to satisfaction, like a man finally collecting on an investment he'd been waiting years to cash in. When I finished, I placed the pen down exactly where it had been, aligning it with the edge of the document, a small habit I'd kept for decades, one of those tiny details that used to make him smile, back when he still noticed things like that, and I slid the papers forward without a word. Daniel didn't hesitate, he picked them up immediately, his eyes scanning just long enough to confirm what he already expected, and then he signed, quick, confident, a sharp flourish at the end of his name, and when he was done, he leaned back in his chair and let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like relief. That's that, he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, and for a moment, just a moment, the room seemed to settle into his version of reality, a clean ending, a simple division, a story where he walked away intact and I walked away diminished. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead, not at him, not at Emily, but at the judge, who had been watching everything with a level of attention Daniel clearly hadn't noticed, and it was in that stillness, that narrow space between what everyone thought had just happened and what was about to happen, that I allowed myself the smallest, almost imperceptible smile, not because I was happy, and not because I had forgiven anything, but because I understood something Daniel didn't, something he had never bothered to learn in all the years we had been together. Silence is not the same as ignorance, and patience is not the same as weakness. The judge adjusted the papers in front of him, his expression unreadable, and cleared his throat softly, the sound cutting through the room just enough to pull everyone's attention back to the bench, and Daniel, still leaning back, still wearing that quiet, confident smirk, didn't even bother to sit up straight, as if whatever came next couldn't possibly matter. I remained still, my posture composed, my hands resting lightly against each other, feeling the steady rhythm of my pulse, not fast, not anxious, just present, grounded, because I had already lived through the worst part of this story, the slow unraveling, the nights spent alone in a house that no longer felt like mine, the conversations that stopped halfway through sentences, the subtle shifts that eventually became impossible to ignore, and once you've seen everything clearly, truly clearly, fear loses its edge. The judge glanced down once more, then up again, his gaze moving briefly between us, and in that brief pause, I could almost hear the version of events Daniel had constructed in his mind, the one where this was the final page, the closing line, the neat conclusion he could walk away from without looking back, and I let him have that, just for a second longer, because some lessons land harder when they arrive late. I had signed exactly where he wanted me to sign, I had said nothing when he expected me to protest, I had given him the silence he mistook for defeat. And now, as the judge began to speak, I sat there calmly, knowing that the story Daniel believed he had just finished was only just beginning to unfold. I did not look at Daniel when the judge began to speak, not because I was afraid of what I might see in his expression, but because I already knew it. I had lived beside that expression for nearly 4 decades, the quiet certainty, the belief that control once established could never be taken away, and I had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments were not when he raised his voice, but when he lowered it, when everything became calm and precise and decided. Before we finalize this agreement, the judge said, his tone measured, professional, the kind of voice that did not invite interruption. There is an additional document that has been submitted for consideration, and I could feel, without turning my head, the subtle shift in Daniel's posture, not alarm yet, not even concern, just a slight tightening, the first crack in a surface he had polished so carefully. I kept my hands folded, my fingers resting lightly against each other, the way I used to sit at dinner parties, when I wanted to appear completely at ease, even when I was anything but, and I let my eyes settle on the edge of the bench, on the grain of the wood, on something neutral, something steady, because this was not the moment to react. This was the moment to allow everything to unfold exactly as it was meant to. What document? Daniel asked, his voice still controlled but sharper now, less casual, and there it was, that shift from assumption to awareness, the beginning of a question he had not expected to ask. The judge did not answer immediately. He simply adjusted the papers in front of him, aligning them with deliberate care, and that small, unhurried movement seemed to stretch the silence in the room just enough to make it noticeable. Just enough to make it uncomfortable. I heard Emily move slightly behind him. The faint sound of fabric against the chair, and for a brief moment I imagined the look on her face, not the practiced smile she showed at family gatherings, but the one that appeared when she thought no one was watching, calculating, attentive, always a step ahead, or at least she believed she was. This document, the judge continued, was filed this morning by counsel representing Mrs. Whitmore, and this time I did turn my head, not toward Daniel, but toward the side of the courtroom where Mr. Harrison stood, his posture straight, his expression calm in that way that only comes from long experience, from knowing exactly when to speak and exactly when to remain silent. Daniel followed my gaze, and I watched as recognition flickered across his face, brief but unmistakable, because he knew that name. He remembered the man who had once handled every major decision our family had made, every purchase, every contract, every arrangement that required discretion and precision, and I saw, for the first time that morning, something that was not confidence, not control, but uncertainty. There must be some mistake, Daniel said, and the words came a fraction too quickly, as if he had not had time to choose them carefully, and that was when I knew, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, that he was no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath him. I remained still, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady, because this was not the moment for satisfaction, not yet. This was the moment for patience, the same patience that had carried me through quiet dinners where no one asked my opinion, through conversations that happened around me instead of with me, through decisions that were presented as conclusions rather than discussions. There is no mistake, the judge replied, his voice even leaving no room for argument. The document in question is a legally binding amendment, and it directly pertains to the division of assets in this case. And the word amendment seemed to linger in the air, heavier than the others, because it implied something Daniel had not accounted for, something outside the structure he believed he had already secured. I could feel his attention shift fully now, not just toward the judge, but toward the entire room, as if he were trying to locate the exact point where things had begun to move beyond his control, and I wondered briefly which moment he would choose, which conversation he would revisit in his mind, searching for the detail he had missed. I thought of the night he had changed the access codes to the accounts without telling me, the way he had explained it as a precaution, a simplification, something that made things easier, and I remembered how I had nodded, how I had accepted the explanation without argument, because sometimes the most effective response is not resistance but observation. We will proceed with the reading, the judge said, and there was a finality in his tone now, a quiet authority that did not need to be emphasized. And as he lifted the document from the stack, I felt the room settle into a different kind of silence, not the controlled quiet from before, but something sharper, more attentive, as if everyone present understood, on some level, that whatever came next would not be routine. Daniel leaned forward slightly, no longer relaxed, no longer leaning back in easy confidence, and Emily's posture behind him had changed as well, her shoulders drawn in just enough to suggest tension, though she tried to hold her composure, tried to maintain that same careful stillness that had served her so well until now. I lowered my gaze again, not out of submission but out of choice, because I did not need to watch their reactions to know what was happening. I had already seen this moment in my mind. More times than I could count, had walked through it step by step until every detail felt familiar, until there was nothing left to surprise me. The judge began to read, his voice steady, each word placed carefully, deliberately, and as the first lines of the document filled the room, I closed my eyes for just a second, not in relief, not in triumph, but in recognition, because this was not the beginning of anything new. It was the result of everything that had already happened, every quiet observation, every unanswered question, every moment I had chosen to listen instead of speak, and now finally, those choices were beginning to take shape in a way Daniel could no longer ignore. The judge's voice did not rise or fall as he continued reading, but there was a weight to each word now, a deliberate clarity that made it impossible to dismiss anything as incidental, and I could feel the shift in the room not through sound, but through stillness, the kind that settles when people realize they are no longer observing something routine, but something that will change the outcome of everything they thought they understood. This amendment, the judge read, is attached to the original estate plan established by the late Charles Whitmore, and at the mention of Daniel's father, I saw his jaw tighten just slightly, a reflex he had never quite been able to control, because Charles had always been the one person Daniel could not outmaneuver, the one man whose approval he had chased well into adulthood. Even after there was nothing left to prove, I kept my gaze lowered, but I did not miss the way Daniel's hand moved to the edge of the table, fingers pressing lightly against the surface as if grounding himself, as if trying to re-establish control through something physical, something immediate. The amendment outlines specific conditions under which the distribution of assets may be altered. The judge continued, and the word condition seemed to settle heavily between us, because it implied rules Daniel had not written, boundaries he had not defined. I thought back to the afternoon, months earlier, when Mr. Harrison had asked me to meet him in his office, the way the sunlight had come through the tall windows, catching on the edges of framed documents and casting long, quiet shadows across the room, and how he had spoken carefully, not dramatically, not urgently, but with the kind of precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding. He had placed the document in front of me then, his hand resting lightly on the corner as if to anchor it in place, and he had said, "Your father-in-law believed in contingencies, Margaret." And I remember how I had looked at the pages, at the formal language that felt distant and yet strangely personal, as if it had been written for a moment no one had expected to arrive. In the event of marital misconduct, the judge read now, bringing me back to the present, and I heard a faint intake of breath from somewhere behind Daniel, perhaps Emily, perhaps someone else, it did not matter, because the words themselves were enough, clear and unmistakable. Daniel shifted in his chair, not dramatically, but enough to break the stillness he had maintained earlier, and for the first time since we had entered the courtroom, he looked directly at me, searching, not with anger, not yet, but with something closer to disbelief, as if he were trying to understand how I had become part of a narrative he did not control. I met his gaze briefly, just long enough for him to see that there was no confusion in my expression, no hesitation, and then I looked away again, because the truth does not need to be held in place by eye contact, it stands on its own. Any beneficiary found to have engaged in actions that deliberately undermine the legal or financial standing of their spouse, the judge continued, shall forfeit all claims to the primary estate holdings, and there it was stated plainly, without emphasis, without drama, just a fact laid out in a voice that did not need to convince anyone of its validity. The silence that followed was different from before, not stretched, not anticipatory, but immediate, as if the room itself had absorbed the meaning all at once. Daniel's fingers tightened against the table, and I could see the calculation begin behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment, the attempt to find a way around something that had already been sealed long before he ever walked into this courtroom. I remembered the way he had dismissed small details over the years, the way he had brushed aside anything that did not fit into his immediate plans, and I wondered, not for the first time, how many warnings he had overlooked simply because they did not seem urgent at the time. The court has reviewed the submitted evidence supporting the activation of this clause, the judge said, and that was when Daniel's composure finally faltered, not completely, not visibly to anyone who did not know him well, but enough for me to recognize it, enough for me to see the precise moment when certainty gave way to doubt. What evidence? he asked, and now there was no smoothness left in his voice, only tension, controlled but unmistakable, and I felt a quiet, steady calm settle over me. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a sense of alignment, as if everything had finally moved into its proper place. I thought of the months I had spent watching, listening, allowing conversations to unfold without interruption, allowing assumptions to reveal themselves in small, careless ways, and I understood then that the most powerful position is not the one that speaks the loudest, but the one that sees the most. The judge did not answer Daniel immediately. He simply turned a page, the soft sound of paper shifting carrying through the room with surprising clarity, and continued. Documentation provided indicates a pattern of financial concealment and misrepresentation within the marriage. And I did not need to look at Emily to know that her stillness had changed, that the careful composure she had maintained was beginning to fracture at the edges. Daniel leaned forward now, no longer able to remain detached, his earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, more urgent, and I sat exactly as I had before, my posture unchanged, my hands resting lightly in my lap, because this was not a moment that required movement, it required presence, the kind that does not waver when everything else begins to shift. The judge's voice continued, steady and unyielding, and as each sentence settled into the air, I felt the distance between what Daniel had expected and what was actually happening widen. Not suddenly, but steadily, like a line being drawn that could not be crossed back over once it had been made visible, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, that this was not about taking anything from him, it was about allowing the truth to take its place, without interruption, without resistance, exactly as it was meant to be seen. Daniel's voice came again, sharper now, no longer measured, no longer controlled. "This is irrelevant," he said, leaning forward as if proximity alone could interrupt what was already in motion, but the judge did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption, and that was when the imbalance became undeniable, because for the first time since we had entered that room Daniel was speaking without being heard. I watched the shift happen not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small precise fractures, the way his shoulders tightened, the way his gaze moved too quickly from the judge to Mr. Harrison and then to me, searching for something that would restore the version of reality he had built so carefully. This clause, the judge continued, his tone unchanged, was designed to protect the integrity of the original estate, specifically in circumstances where trust between spouses has been compromised through intentional actions, and the word intentional seemed to land with particular weight, because it removed any possibility of misunderstanding, any room for explanation that could soften what had already been defined. I remembered the early years of my marriage, the quiet mornings when Daniel would leave for work before sunrise, the way he would pause at the doorway just long enough to say something simple, something ordinary, and how I had believed at the time that those small gestures were evidence of something lasting, something stable, and perhaps they had been once, but stability is not something that maintains itself without attention, and over time, the pauses became shorter, the words fewer, until eventually there was nothing left but routine, and even that began to shift. The documentation submitted, the judge went on, includes financial records, correspondence, and account activity that demonstrate a pattern of asset diversion, and I felt the word pattern settle into the space between us, because patterns do not form overnight, they require repetition, consistency, the kind of behavior that becomes invisible to the person creating it, but unmistakable to someone willing to observe it closely. Daniel shook his head once, a small, almost dismissive gesture, but it lacked the certainty it once carried, and when he spoke again there was a strain beneath his words. "This is being taken out of context," he said, and I realized then how often context had been used as a shield, as a way to reshape events into something more convenient, something more acceptable, but context loses its power when the full picture is laid out in front of everyone, piece by piece, without interruption. I thought of the evenings when he would sit in his study with the door partially closed, the soft glow of the desk lamp visible from the hallway, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke on the phone, conversations that ended the moment I stepped closer, explanations offered before I even asked a question, and how I had accepted them, not because I believed them completely, but because I understood that pressing too hard too soon reveals nothing, while patience allows everything to surface on its own. Additionally, the judge said, turning another page with deliberate care, there is evidence of coordinated financial activity involving a secondary party. And, this time the silence that followed was immediate and absolute. as if the air itself had been drawn out of the room for a brief moment. I did not need to turn to know where that attention had shifted. I could feel it, the collective awareness moving toward Emily, toward the quiet figure who had remained just behind Daniel, close enough to be part of everything, distant enough to appear uninvolved. For the first time since the reading had begun, Emily moved in a way that was not controlled, not calculated, her hand adjusting the edge of her sleeve, a small, instinctive motion that revealed more than any words could have, and I understood then that certainty, once disrupted, does not collapse all at once, it unravels slowly, thread by thread, until there is nothing left to hold it together. Daniel turned slightly in his chair, not fully, just enough to glance back at her, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them, something unspoken but unmistakable, a recognition, perhaps, or a realization that whatever understanding they had relied on was no longer sufficient. I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my expression steady, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required endurance, the ability to remain present while everything else shifted around me. The court will consider this amendment as binding, the judge continued, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had from the beginning, and as he spoke, I felt the final pieces of Daniel's certainty begin to fall away, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know him as I did, but enough for me to see the exact moment when control slipped beyond his reach. I thought of the many times I had been dismissed with a quiet assurance that everything was under control, that there was nothing to worry about, and I understood now that control, when built on omission and assumption, is never as stable as it appears. Daniel's hands, which had once rested so confidently on the table, now hovered slightly above it, as if unsure where to settle, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, tighter. "This does not change the agreement," he said, but there was no conviction behind the words, only the echo of something that had already begun to fade. I did not respond. I did not need to, because the truth does not require reinforcement once it has been clearly stated, it simply exists steady and unyielding, and as the judge prepared to continue, I allowed myself a single quiet breath, not of relief, not of triumph but of recognition, because this moment was not about winning or losing, it was about something far simpler, and far more final, it was about everything being seen exactly as it was, without distortion, without omission, without the careful framing that had once made it possible for Daniel to believe he could rewrite the outcome before it had even begun. The judge paused only briefly before continuing, and that pause, small as it was, seemed to stretch across the entire room, giving every person present just enough time to understand that what had already been said could not be undone, and what was about to be said would not soften it. Based on the submitted amendment and supporting documentation, he said, his voice steady, measured, the court recognizes that the conditions required to activate the forfeiture clause have been met. And the word forfeiture settled with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not emphasized, but absolute in its meaning. Daniel exhaled sharply, the sound controlled but unmistakable, and for the first time since the proceedings began, he did not try to interrupt immediately. He simply sat there, absorbing, recalculating, searching for something that would restore the balance he had lost. I watched him without turning my head, seeing him not as the man I had once known, but as he was in that moment, a man confronted not with accusation but with structure, with a framework that did not bend to persuasion or confidence, and I realized how unfamiliar that must have felt to him. As a result, the judge continued, turning another page with deliberate care. The primary estate holdings, including residential property, investment accounts, and associated business interests, are to be reassigned in accordance with the original intent of the estate plan. And there was no need for elaboration, no need for clarification, because the language itself was precise enough to leave no ambiguity. Daniel leaned forward again, but this time there was no trace of the earlier ease, no hint of the quiet superiority he had carried into the room, only urgency, controlled but evident. "This is not applicable," he said, his voice lower now, tighter. "Those assets were restructured years ago." And I heard in his words not certainty but insistence, the kind that comes when someone is trying to hold onto a version of reality that is already slipping away. The judge looked at him then, not with impatience, not with judgment, but with a calm acknowledgement that did not invite debate. "The restructuring you are referring to has been reviewed," he replied, "and it does not override the conditions outlined in the amendment." And that was when the last layer of Daniel's composure began to thin, not collapse, not yet, but enough to reveal the strain beneath it. I felt no need to move, no need to speak, because everything that needed to be said was already present in the room, laid out in language that did not require interpretation, and I understood then that silence, when paired with clarity, is not empty, it is definitive. Behind Daniel, Emily shifted again, her posture no longer perfectly aligned, her hands now clasped more tightly than before, and I wondered, briefly, whether she was thinking about the same moments I was, the conversations held in low voices, the assumptions made in quiet certainty, the belief that control, once established, could be maintained indefinitely. Furthermore, the judge continued, his tone unchanged, the evidence presented indicates that the actions in question were not incidental, but part of a sustained effort to redirect financial control away from the marital structure. And the phrase sustained effort seemed to carry its own weight because it spoke not of a single decision but of a pattern, a sequence, something that could not be dismissed as accidental. Daniel's gaze moved quickly now, from the judge to Mr. Harrison and then to me. And this time there was no attempt to hide it, no effort to maintain the detached composure he had relied on earlier, only a direct, searching look as if he were trying to find, in my expression, some indication that this could still be negotiated, still be adjusted, still be contained. I met his eyes for a moment, just long enough for him to see that there was nothing uncertain there, nothing left to question, and then I looked away again because the truth does not need to be reinforced through confrontation, it simply stands. Accordingly, the judge said, bringing the document to its conclusion, the court recognizes Mrs. Margaret Whitmore as the sole beneficiary of the primary estate assets effective immediately. And there it was, stated plainly, without emphasis, without pause, a conclusion that did not rely on emotion or interpretation, only on the structure that had been established long before any of us entered that room. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, dense with understanding, with realization, with the quiet recognition that something irreversible had just taken place. Daniel did not speak immediately this time, and that, more than anything else, marked the shift because he had always been quick to respond, quick to assert, quick to redirect, and now he sat there still, his hands resting on the table without purpose, as if the gestures that had once come so easily no longer had a place. I thought of the many years I had spent adapting, adjusting, allowing space where there had once been connection, and I understood now that what I had once seen as endurance had also been preparation, a slow accumulation of awareness that had led, step by step, to this moment. Emily's composure, so carefully maintained until now, had begun to fracture in subtle ways, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know where to look, but enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it, the realization that the outcome they had anticipated was no longer within reach. I remained where I was, my posture unchanged, my expression steady, because this was not a moment that required reaction. It required presence, the kind that does not shift when everything else does. The judge set the document down with a soft, final motion, and in that small, quiet gesture, the proceedings reached their natural conclusion, not with a dramatic declaration, not with raised voices, but with something far more definitive, a simple, unalterable recognition of what had already been set in motion long before any of us had taken our seats. Daniel did not move for several seconds after the judge finished speaking, and in that stillness there was something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to the man I had known for most of my life, because Daniel had always been in motion, always adjusting, always recalibrating, but now he sat there as if the next step had been removed entirely, as if the sequence he had relied on no longer existed. I watched the moment settle over him, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual realization, the kind that arrives quietly and then refuses to leave, and I understood that what he was facing was not just the loss of assets or control, but the absence of certainty, the one thing he had always counted on. "This is not final," he said eventually, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier confidence, and I recognized the tone, not because it was strong, but because it was searching, reaching for something that had already moved beyond his grasp. The judge looked at him with the same steady expression he had maintained throughout. "This ruling is effective immediately," he replied, not unkindly but without hesitation, without any space for reinterpretation, and in that simple response the final thread of Daniel's argument seemed to dissolve. I felt no urge to speak, no need to respond, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to contest, and I realized then that closure does not always come with a sense of completion. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet absence, the removal of something that had once filled every corner of your life. Behind Daniel, Emily shifted again, But this time the movement was less controlled, less deliberate, her posture no longer aligned with the careful composure she had maintained earlier, and I could see the change not just in her movements, but in the way she held herself, as if the certainty she had relied on had been quietly withdrawn without warning. Daniel turned toward her then, fully this time, not just a glance, not just a brief acknowledgement but a direct look, and in that exchange there was no longer any pretense, no careful alignment of understanding, only a shared awareness that something had not gone as expected. I did not need to hear what passed between them, because I had already seen enough small details over time to understand the structure they had built, and how easily it could unravel once the foundation was exposed. I thought of the months leading up to this day, the quiet observations, the subtle inconsistencies, the moments that did not quite align, and how I had chosen again and again, not to confront them directly, not because I was unaware, but because I understood that truth, when forced too early, tends to scatter, while truth allowed to develop on its own eventually gathers enough weight to stand on its own. "We are done here," the judge said, his voice calm, bringing the proceedings to a close without ceremony, and that simple statement carried more finality than anything else that had been said, because it marked the end not just of the hearing, but of the version of events Daniel had believed in. People began to shift in their seats, quiet movements, soft sounds, the subtle return of motion to a room that had been held in stillness for too long. And I remained where I was for a moment longer, allowing everything to settle, allowing the space to return to something ordinary. Daniel stood slowly, not with the sharp, decisive movement he had entered with, but with a measured hesitation, as if he were adjusting to a different set of conditions, and when he looked at me again there was no smirk, no trace of the quiet confidence he had carried earlier, only a question that he did not ask, perhaps because he already knew there was no answer that would change anything. I met his gaze. Briefly, not to challenge him, not to explain anything, but simply to acknowledge the moment for what it was, and then I looked away, because some endings do not require words, they require distance. Emily remained seated for a second longer before standing, her movements slower now, less precise, and I wondered if she was replaying the same moments I had, the conversations, the assumptions, the quiet agreements that had once felt so certain. I rose from my chair without haste, smoothing the front of my jacket out of habit, a small familiar gesture that felt grounding in a room that had just shifted so completely, and as I turned toward the aisle I felt something unexpected, not relief, not triumph but clarity, the kind that comes when everything has finally aligned with what you have known. Quietly, for a very long time, Mr. Harrison gave me a small nod as I passed, nothing dramatic, nothing that drew attention, just a simple acknowledgement of a process completed, and I returned it with the same restraint, because this had never been about display, it had been about precision, about timing, about allowing the right moment to arrive without forcing it. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel Daniel's gaze on me, not heavy, not demanding but present, and I did not turn back, not out of resentment, not out of anger, but because I understood that whatever needed to be said between us had already been said, not in words, but in the structure that now stood firmly between what had been and what would be. The doors opened quietly, the sound soft but distinct, and as I stepped into the hallway, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just different, as if I had moved from one defined space into another that had yet to take shape, and for the first time in a long while that uncertainty did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something to accept, something to step into without hesitation, because the past, for all its weight, no longer held the same authority it once did. I did not stop walking until I reached the far end of the hallway, where the noise of the courtroom softened into something distant and indistinct, and even then I did not rush, because I had learned that rushing belongs to moments of panic or excitement, and this was neither. This was something quieter, something more deliberate, the kind of moment that does not demand speed but presence. The polished floor reflected faint outlines of movement, attorneys passing, voices low and controlled, the everyday rhythm of a place where decisions are made and unmade without ceremony, and I found myself noticing details I had ignored before, the steady hum of overhead lights, the faint scent of paper and polish, the way people avoided looking directly at one another unless necessary, as if every conversation carried more weight than it appeared to. "Margaret?" Daniel's voice came from behind me, not loud, not commanding, but present enough that I could not pretend not to hear it, and I paused. Not immediately, not abruptly, but after a few more steps, allowing the moment to settle before turning. He stood several feet away, closer than he had been in months, yet somehow more distant than ever, his posture no longer defined by certainty, but by something less stable, something that shifted with each breath. "We need to talk," he said, and the words were familiar, so familiar that for a moment they echoed with the weight of years, of conversations that began with the same phrase and ended with compromises that were never quite balanced. I looked at him, really. Looked at him, not as the man I had once built a life with, but as he stood now, and I realized how much of what I had once seen had been shaped by expectation rather than reality. "There is nothing left to discuss," I replied, my voice even, not cold, not raised, just steady, because I had learned that clarity does not require emphasis, it requires certainty. He shook his head slightly, a reflex more than a decision. "This is not how this was supposed to go," he said, and there it was again. Not anger, not accusation, but confusion, as if the outcome itself had violated an agreement he believed existed beyond what had been written or spoken. I felt no need to respond to that, because expectation, when built on assumption, does not obligate reality to comply, and I had spent too many years adjusting myself to fit into outcomes that were never designed with me in mind. "You knew about this," he added after a moment, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the question beneath it, and I held his gaze for a second, not to challenge him, but to acknowledge the truth in his words without expanding on it. "I understood enough," I said, and that was all, because understanding does not always require explanation. Sometimes it simply exists quietly until it is needed. Behind him, I noticed Emily had stopped a few steps back, her expression no longer composed in the way it had been inside the courtroom, but carefully neutral, as if she were trying to reconstruct a version of herself that fit the new circumstances, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she was realizing the same thing I had, that control built on quiet manipulation often collapses without warning when exposed to something more structured, more deliberate. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I had seen countless times before, a habit from years of dealing with pressure, negotiations, situations where control needed to be re-established quickly. But this time the gesture lingered, as if he were searching for something it no longer provided. "This changes everything," he said, and I nodded slightly, not in agreement but in recognition, because change had been happening for a long time. This was simply the moment it became visible. "It clarifies everything," I replied, and I saw the difference register, not fully, not immediately, but enough to create a pause, a space where his version of events no longer aligned with mine. He looked at me then with something that might have been frustration or perhaps disbelief, but it did not matter because neither of those things had the power they once did. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, and the question was simple, almost practical, but beneath it was something else, something that suggested he still saw my future as something connected to his, something that required his awareness or approval. I considered the question for a moment, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to answer it without any trace of the past shaping the response. "I am going to move forward," I said, and the words felt exactly as they should, not dramatic, not final in a way that demanded reaction, just accurate. He opened his mouth slightly as if to say something more, but then stopped, and in that pause, I understood that whatever he had been about to say belonged to a version of our relationship that no longer existed. Emily stepped closer then, just enough to be fully within the space between us, her presence no longer subtle, and for the first time she spoke directly to me, her voice measured but lacking the effortless confidence it once carried. "Margaret, we can work this out," she said, and I almost smiled, not because the words were surprising, but because they were predictable, the last attempt to reshape something that had already been defined. I looked at her, taking in the careful tone, the controlled posture, and I realized that what she was offering was not resolution, but adjustment, a recalibration that still centered around the same assumptions. "It has already been worked out," I said quietly, and there was nothing more to add because the structure now in place did not require negotiation, it simply existed. Neither of them spoke after that, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not heavy but clear, the kind of silence that comes when there is nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to reshape, and as I turned and continued down the hallway, I did not look back, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I understood, finally and completely, that looking back was no longer necessary. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a soft, controlled click, and for a moment I simply stood there, not moving forward, not looking back, allowing the quiet shift in atmosphere to settle around me, because the air outside felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. as if something that had been lingering for years had finally dissolved without needing to be forced. The late afternoon sun stretched across the steps in long, pale lines, catching the edges of passing cars and distant buildings, and I found myself noticing how ordinary everything looked, how unchanged the world seemed despite what had just taken place, and I realized that most endings do not announce themselves to the outside world. They exist quietly, contained within the people who have lived through them. I began to walk down the steps at a steady pace, my heels making soft, measured sounds against the stone, each step deliberate, not rushed, because I no longer felt the need to arrive anywhere. Quickly, I was already where I needed to be. My phone vibrated once in my bag, a small, familiar interruption, and when I reached inside and glanced at the screen, I saw a series of missed calls and messages, names that had once carried weight, once demanded immediate attention, but now appeared as simple notifications, information without urgency, and I slipped the phone back without responding, because there are moments when silence is not avoidance but choice. I thought of the house, the one that had held so many versions of my life, the one that now, by structure and by law, stood firmly in my name, and yet what I felt was not possession, not even relief but distance, a recognition that ownership does not always carry the meaning we assign to it, that sometimes what matters is not what remains, but what no longer does. A black sedan waited at the curb, the driver stepping forward slightly as he recognized me, and I nodded in acknowledgement, the small exchange of routine grounding in its simplicity, because there is comfort in interactions that do not require explanation. As I settled into the back seat, the door closing with a quiet finality, I allowed myself to lean back, not in exhaustion but in stillness, letting the city move past the window in slow, steady frames, each building, each street corner, each passing figure part of a world that continued without pause. I did not replay the courtroom in my mind, did not revisit the exact words or the precise expressions, because I did not need to. The outcome was already fixed, already understood, and revisiting it would not change its meaning. Instead, my thoughts moved to something quieter, something less defined, the space that follows when something long-standing has been resolved, the moment when identity begins to shift, not dramatically, not all at once but gradually, as old patterns lose their relevance. I remembered the version of myself who had once measured decisions by how they would be received, who had adjusted tone, timing, even silence to maintain a balance that no longer existed, and I understood now that balance requires participation from both sides, and without it, what remains is not harmony but accommodation. The car turned onto a familiar street, and I watched as the neighborhood came into view, the same houses, the same trees, the same quiet arrangement of life continuing as it always had, and yet I felt no pull toward returning immediately, no urgency to step back into spaces that no longer held the same meaning. Instead, I allowed the car to continue past, giving myself the distance to see it differently, not as a place of obligation, but as one option among many, something I could approach on my own terms rather than out of habit. The driver glanced at me briefly in the rearview mirror, waiting for direction, and I met his gaze for a moment before giving him a new address, not because I had planned it in advance, but because the decision felt natural in that moment, a quiet shift toward something not yet defined but no longer tied to what had been. As the city unfolded in a different direction, I felt a calm settle in that was not dependent on outcome, not tied to victory or loss but rooted in clarity, the kind that does not fluctuate with circumstance, because it comes from understanding rather than reaction. I thought of Daniel and Emily, not with anger, not with regret, but with a kind of distance that felt complete, as if they belonged to a chapter that had already been closed without needing to be revisited, and I realized that closure is not always something you declare. Sometimes it is something you recognize. Quietly, without announcement, the car slowed at a red light, and I watched as pedestrians crossed the street, each one moving with their own purpose, their own direction, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside a courtroom not far away, and I found something reassuring in that, the idea that life continues, not waiting for resolution, not pausing for reflection, but moving steadily forward, offering space for those who are ready to step into it. When the light changed, the car moved again, and I sat there, composed, present, aware of the quiet steadiness within me, and for the first time in a long while, I understood that what I carried with me was not the weight of what had ended, but the clarity of what no longer needed to be held. The car came to a slow stop in front of a quiet building I had not visited in years, a place that once existed on the edges of my life, something I had postponed, deferred, told myself I would return to when there was time, when things were settled, when the conditions felt right, and as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, I realized how often I had waited for permission that was never mine to give away in the first place. The air carried a light breeze, just enough to move the leaves along the curb, just enough to remind me that movement does not always need force, sometimes it only needs direction. And I stood there for a moment looking at the entrance, not with hesitation but with awareness, because this was not about where I was going, it was about how I was arriving. Inside, the space was calm, understated, the kind of place that did not demand attention but offered it quietly, and as I walked through the door, I felt something settle into place, not as a sudden realization but as a gradual alignment, the kind that happens when your actions finally match what you have known for a long time. A woman at the front desk looked up and offered a small, polite smile, the kind that does not assume anything, does not ask questions before they are needed, and I returned it with the same simplicity, because there was no story I needed to explain, no version of myself I needed to present, I was simply there. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice even. And I nodded slightly. "Good afternoon," I replied, the words steady, unforced, and in that brief exchange I understood something that had taken me years to recognize, that identity is not something defined by others' expectations, but by the choices you make when no one is directing you. I signed my name on a simple form, the same careful script I had used earlier that day, but it felt different now. Not because the letters had changed, but because the meaning behind them had shifted, no longer tied to obligation, no longer shaped by compromise, but grounded in something that belonged entirely to me. As I handed the pen back, I noticed how natural the motion felt, how unremarkable, and yet how significant, because it marked not an ending but a continuation, a movement forward that did not require announcement. I moved further into the space, past rooms filled with quiet activity, people engaged in their own paths, their own decisions, and I felt no need to compare, no need to measure, because this was not about where I stood in relation to anyone else, it was about where I stood in relation to myself. My phone remained silent in my bag, and I did not reach for it, because whatever conversations waited there belonged to a version of my life that no longer held the same urgency, and I understood now that not every call requires an answer, not every message demands a response. I thought briefly of Daniel, of the look in his eyes when certainty left him, and I did not feel satisfaction, not in the way I once might have imagined, but something quieter, something more complete, a recognition that what had happened was not about taking anything from him, but about allowing what was already defined to stand without interference. Emily's face came to mind as well, not with resentment, not with judgment, but with a kind of distance that felt settled, because whatever role she had played no longer extended into my present, it remained where it belonged, in a part of my life that had already concluded. I paused near a window, looking out at the street beyond, watching as people moved through their own routines, unaware of the shifts that had taken place, and I realized how much of life unfolds without witness, how many transformations happen quietly, without recognition, without acknowledgement, and yet remain no less real. I placed my hand lightly against the glass, not as a gesture of reflection, but as a simple connection to the moment, and I felt the steadiness in my own breath, the absence of the tension that had once accompanied every decision, every interaction, every silence. For years I had measured my actions against reactions, adjusted my words to avoid conflict, shaped my presence to maintain a balance that was never truly shared, and now, standing there, I understood that balance, when it exists, does not require effort, it does not demand constant correction, it simply holds. I stepped back from the window and continued forward, not with hesitation, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be confirmed, and as I moved deeper into a space that belonged entirely to the present, I carried with me not the weight of what had been resolved, but the clarity of what no longer needed to be carried, and in that clarity there was something simple, something unspoken, something that did not need to be declared aloud, only understood, that I had not lost anything that mattered, I had only let go of what never truly belonged to me in the first place.